Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Those of us who voted and campaigned to leave the European Union did so for a number of reasons. I was always a constitutional leaver. For me, the test of this bill is, does it return the sovereignty that we sought? And the answer is yes. Why? Because there is no subjugation to EU law or EU jurisprudence, no direct effect, no direct application. Retention of any of these would have been incompatible with a sovereign state, and in fact, from our accession to the EC through various EU treaties, all of these elements were incompatible with the concept that those who live under the law should be able to determine those who make the law. That is what we have regained in this process. The second test for me is, does this allow us to have a genuinely independent trade policy? Let's remember, we were told it would take more than 10 years to reach a free trade agreement with the European Union. It would be impossible to roll over all the EU agreements that we had. I stood at that dispatch box and listened to the opposition incessantly telling us that. And so congratulations to the Department for International Trade, the ministers and officials under Crawford Faulkner for all that they have achieved, and especially to David Frost for landing one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, trade agreement in 11 months. A world record, again, something we were told was not possible. When we voted to leave the European Union, we also voted to leave the single market, although for some of us, remember, the single market is also the single anti-market, with many of the restrictions and protectionisms that it encompasses. But if we want to access the single market as now is, there has to be a price to be paid. If we want to diverge from the rules of the single market, there has to be a price to be paid again. Does this agreement provide effective mechanisms for us to do these things? And my answer again is yes.
Right, Honourable Frankie Way. Does he agree that the mechanisms that this treaty has found are every bit as good as the mechanisms, for example, in the Canada Treaty and all the other treaties that reflect these tensions in free trade agreements?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and not only are they effective mechanisms, they keep us in line with the best international practice which exists, which of course enables us to move forward with greater predictability. And on that point, there are a number of specific elements to welcome. The first is the acceptance of the concept, I'm afraid. The first is the concept of non-regression as a means of ensuring minimum standards, while we accept that the maintenance of those high standards have fixed costs in terms of international commerce, which is why we will always need to compete at the high end of the quality market globally in goods and services. And as the Prime Minister rightly pointed out, we cannot ever become the bargain basement economy because the fixed costs that we have are simply too high. And quite rightly, the British people wouldn't allow us to abandon the standards that we have. It means that we will have to move forward with the natural innovation and creativity of the British people, expanding our export culture, because the bottom line is that without more exports, without more actual trade, any trade agreement is simply a piece of paper. It is upon the natural innovation of the British people that our prosperity will be built in the future. The second element, as my right honourable friend alluded to, is that the concept in dispute resolution of international arbitration is done without the European Court of Justice. And that brings us in line with international trends and practices, which takes us to the third element, which is the mechanism of determining divergence. If there's no ability to determine to diverge, we're not sovereign. If there's not a price to be paid for divergence, the EU would never have reached the agreement with us. What would have been unacceptable would have been the concept of dynamic alignment, automatically taking EU rules into our law over which we've no control. But what is acceptable is that there are penalties for divergence that are clearly set out, that are proportionate, and that are required to show harm rather than simply being put into law. And the most important element of all of this is that it is we who will weigh up the costs of any and benefits of any potential disalignment. Our choice. That is one of the key elements that we have in the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, today opens up a new chapter in our politics. It's the choice between maintaining and strengthening an independent United Kingdom and the new ranks of the rejoiners, who will have us thrust back into accession European politics all over again, consuming all our political time and energy, a future I believe the British public will reject. There are things we do have to still sort out, the future of Gibraltar being one of the important ones, and seeing further details on services, including financial services. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a historic day in our democracy. We've delivered on the referendum, delivered on our election promises, and if for the opposition it's not reasons to be cheerful, at least it's reasons we should all be proud.